In today's episode, we delve into a tragic story of betrayal. A young girl, sold by her father to a 65-year-old man, ends up tragically losing her life in a violent murder. This heartbreaking case raises difficult questions about how such a thing could ever occur. Join us as we uncover the heartbreaking details of this disturbing story and explore the dark circumstances that led to her tragic death. Ellie Mae DeWitt was just 19 years old when her life was cut short. Despite facing many challenges, she was a young woman with big dreams. Ellie grew up in Jesup, Georgia, where she was known for her kind heart and passion for singing. A self-taught musician, she spent hours each day practicing gospel hymns. Her biggest dream was to audition for American Idol and break free from the limitations of her small-town life. She longed to move to Atlanta, a city she had never visited, to pursue a career as a contemporary Christian singer. Despite feeling trapped by her circumstances, Ellie's friends remembered her as hopeful. However, 2 months before her tragic death, her life took a terrifying turn. Her father, Marley Buells, sold her to 65-year-old Eliezer DeWitt, a widowed, retired pastor. Marley, once a lawyer who had lost his license and fallen into financial ruin, agreed to a deal with Marshall for just $5,000 less than the price of a used car. Despite feeling trapped by her circumstances, Ellie's friends remembered her as hopeful. However, 2 months before her tragic death, her life took a terrifying turn. Her father, Marley Buells, sold her to 65-year-old Eliezer DeWitt, a widowed, retired pastor. Marley, once a lawyer who had lost his license and fallen into financial ruin, agreed to a deal with Marshall for just $5,000 less than the price of a used car. For Ellie, the arrangement was nothing short of a betrayal. She had always trusted her father to protect her, not sell her. Marshall, on the other hand, was a familiar figure in Jesup, known for his strict, conservative sermons. To some in the town, he appeared respectable, though others saw him as rigid and unyielding. At home, however, Marshall's controlling nature made Ellie's life unbearable. She wasn't allowed to leave Jesup, let alone follow her dreams of making music. He saw her aspirations as sinful, insisting that her only purpose was to be his wife and nothing more. Marshall frequently used scripture to justify his control over Ellie, telling her it was God's will that she submit to him in silence, even in their sexual relationship. After marrying him, Ellie's friends noticed a significant change in her. She seemed increasingly sad and withdrawn, often looking exhausted and distant. It was clear to those around her that she was deeply unhappy. In the days leading up to her death, Ellie grew more restless. She started expressing a desire to leave Marshall and escape her life in Jesup. Ellie began spending more time with friends at Bev's liquor store, which was run by her friend Bev Turner's family, seeking solace in the company of those who cared about her. Ellie found some comfort in talking with Bev, who listened patiently to her worries and frustrations. She even mentioned the idea of running away to Atlanta to audition for American Idol, holding on to that faint hope, even though she knew the odds of escaping her life were slim. But no matter how much she dreamed, Ellie was constantly reminded of the harsh reality she faced. Living with Marshall was a daily battle, and the sting of her father's betrayal was still fresh in Ellie's mind. She felt isolated, trapped in a life shaped by decisions made for her, yet she never gave up on dreaming of freedom, however distant it seemed. Unfortunately, her hopes for a better future would be shattered, and her dreams would end tragically in death. On a humid morning in late June 2013, the body of a young woman was discovered on the outskirts of Jesup, Georgia, near the old railroad tracks just outside town. Around 7:30 a.m., local truck driver Chuck Fowler was on his usual route when he noticed something unusual by the side of the road. At first, he thought it was just discarded trash, but as he got closer, he realized it was a person. Shocked, Chuck immediately pulled over, called 911, and reported what he had found. He later told authorities that a deep sense of sadness washed over him, realizing he had come across something truly tragic. When police arrived, they confirmed that the body was that of Ellie Mae DeWitt. Ellie's body was found carefully positioned in the ditch, naked, with her eyes closed and her body still. An old leather belt was wrapped tightly around her neck, suggesting she had been strangled. Authorities began searching the area for clues, but soon realized there were no personal belongings, no purse, phone, or anything else near her body. It appeared to authorities that Ellie had been killed elsewhere and then brought to this location. As news of the discovery spread through town, people were left in shock. Many knew Ellie as the quiet young woman who had married Marshall DeWitt, the much older pastor who was known for keeping to himself. Friends and acquaintances struggled to make sense of how Ellie could have ended up in such a tragic situation, especially since she was so private and rarely left Marshall's side. Police began gathering statements from locals, but the details were few. Some people recalled seeing Ellie at Bev's liquor store a few days before, appearing tired but still friendly. Chuck, the driver who had found Ellie, later admitted he couldn't shake the haunting image of her lying there in silence, her life and dreams abruptly cut short. What had begun as a routine delivery had turned into the discovery of a tragic scene that would leave a lasting impact on the town of Jesup. When police arrived at the site near the Jesup railroad tracks, they acted swiftly, cordoning off the area to keep bystanders away. Detective James Coulson, a methodical and level-headed officer in his late 40s, was leading the investigation. Known for his calm and steady approach, he was joined by his partner, Detective Amelia Burke, as they began to carefully examine the crime scene. They focused on finding any clues that might shed light on what happened to Ellie. While inspecting the area, something caught their attention: a weathered leather belt still tightly fastened around Ellie's neck. Detective Coulson quickly observed the belt's distinct design. It wasn't something you'd see every day, and it looked strikingly similar to one often worn by Ellie's husband, Marshall DeWitt. This detail raised a red flag for Coulson, making him suspect that the belt could play a key role in identifying her killer. Ellie's body remained untouched, suggesting she had likely been killed somewhere else and then moved to this location. There were no signs of a struggle, no disturbed soil, and no marks on her hands or feet indicating she hadn't fought back here. Investigators took note of these observations and began to theorize that her killer might have been someone she knew and trusted, someone she wouldn't have felt the need to resist. The detectives methodically photographed the scene from various angles, trying to capture every detail that might have been missed at first glance. Forensic teams arrived shortly afterward, collecting soil samples from the area surrounding Ellie's body and taking swabs for possible DNA evidence. They also dusted the surroundings for fingerprints, hoping to find something that could point them toward a suspect. Given the small size of Giuseppe, it was uncommon for the local team to handle a case this complex. However, they collaborated closely with the Georgia Bureau of Investigation to process the evidence as quickly as possible. The detectives scoured the area for additional clues such as a purse, phone, or even a piece of Ellie's clothing, but found nothing nearby. It soon became clear that whoever had moved her here had been meticulous, taking great care to leave behind no trace. The case began to feel increasingly ominous as Detective Coulson and Detective Burke sifted through the early evidence. The belt continued to stand out as their most promising lead, hinting that Ellie's death might be linked to someone close to her. As word of the investigation spread, locals gathered near the police station, their faces reflecting a blend of curiosity and sorrow. Ellie's death left her friends, family, and the entire community on edge. With the murder weapon potentially tied to someone they knew and the crime taking place in a public area, the Giuseppe police were faced with a haunting mystery. As the day drew to a close and the sun dipped below the horizon, Detective Coulson made a solemn promise he would find justice for Ellie Mae DeWitt. The investigation soon focused on Ellie's husband, 65-year-old Eliezer Marshall DeWitt, a retired pastor well known in Giuseppe. The community had mixed opinions about Marshall. While many admired his decades of service as a preacher, others were unsettled by his strict demeanor and his frequent sermons on obedience. Marshall had recently withdrawn from public life, spending most of his time at home with Ellie, whom he had purchased from her father for just $5,000 only 2 months earlier. When Detective Coulson and Detective Burke arrived to speak with him, they found Marshall sitting alone on his front porch, his Bible resting on his lap. Known for his deeply traditional views, Marshall was a man who firmly believed in a husband's divine authority over his household. During the questioning, Marshall remained composed but evasive, offering little detail as he discussed his marriage to Ellie. He explained that their union had been one of necessity. He needed a dutiful wife to help with household chores, while Ellie, according to him, required strong guidance. When asked about the belt found at the scene, Marshall casually claimed he had recently lost one but couldn't recall when or where. He dismissed the question, suggesting that belts simply wear out over time and that he hadn't given it much attention. Detective Burke, however, pressed on, inquiring about Ellie's recent moods and whether she had been happy in their marriage. Marshall's irritation was evident as the questioning continued. He described Ellie as young and full of dreams, but he firmly believed her aspirations, like wanting to sing in Atlanta, were reckless distractions that had no place in a Christian home. When the detectives asked if he had ever hurt her, his expression hardened. He defensively admitted that he would whip her whenever she made mistakes with the chores, but he quickly added that he never meant to cause her any harm. Marshall insisted that his actions were guided by Scripture, claiming he always acted in Ellie's best interest. However, as the questioning wore on, his frustration grew. He dismissed Ellie's dreams as childish, mocking her aspirations of a singing career with a sneer, clearly unimpressed by what he saw as mere distractions. Marshall confessed that he had forbidden Ellie from leaving Giuseppe, fearing that the outside world might corrupt her. As the detectives began to piece things together, it became clear that Marshall's control over Ellie's life was extensive, restricting her choices, her friendships, and even her faith. Despite this, he continued to deny any involvement in her death, portraying himself as a misunderstood protector rather than a potential suspect. Despite his denials, Marshall's statements raised several troubling questions. His dismissive attitude toward Ellie's dreams, his tight control over her life, and his nonchalant response about the missing belt all suggested that he viewed Ellie not as a partner, but as a possession. As the detectives left the house that day, they were increasingly convinced that Marshall's beliefs and behavior might have played a significant role in Ellie's tragic death. As the investigation moved forward, detectives shifted their focus to Ellie Mae's father, Marley J. Buell. Once a promising lawyer, Marley had been disbarred after a series of financial troubles and a public scandal. In Giuseppe, he was known for his bold personality, sharp legal mind, and a penchant for reckless behavior. At 43, Marley was a far cry from the respected attorney he had once been. Marley's fall from grace had left him bitter and financially strained, spending most nights at Rusty's bar or at the liquor store, where he accumulated debt he struggled to repay. When Detective Coulson and Detective Burke arrived at his small, cluttered home, they found Marley nursing a drink, clearly unfazed by their arrival. Marley's body language was defensive, and he greeted the detectives with a half-hearted shrug. When questioned, he appeared indifferent, more focused on his financial struggles than on his daughter's death. He described Ellie as a stubborn girl, often lost in dreams of a life that, in his view, was far beyond her grasp. Marley admitted he had arranged Ellie's marriage to Marshall as a way to settle a significant debt he owed to the local liquor store. When Detective Burke asked about his last conversation with Ellie, Marley merely shrugged and remarked that she had become too soft and needed a man to shape her up. His dismissive attitude and lack of remorse deeply unsettled the detectives, who noted his cold indifference to both his daughter's fate and the situation surrounding her death. Marley made no effort to conceal that he saw Ellie more as an asset than a daughter. She wasn't going to make it big, he said, rolling his eyes. This ain't some American Idol fairy tale. When Detective Coulson questioned him about his financial situation, Marley admitted that the $5,000 from Marshall barely made a dent in his mounting debts. He mentioned that Ellie had tried to confide in him about her unhappiness in the marriage. But he had dismissed her concerns, telling her that her dreams were foolish. When asked if he had ever considered Ellie's feelings, Marley seemed irritated, muttering, "I didn't raise her to be a princess." As the questioning wore on, Marley grew more irritable. His answers became increasingly vague, and he began deflecting, blaming Ellie's youth and wild ideas for the problems in her life. When asked if he thought her marriage could have played a role in her death, he scoffed, accusing the detectives of wasting their time with him. "Everyone knows Marshall's the one controlling her," he snapped. Despite Marley's lack of cooperation, the detectives couldn't ignore the evident strain in his relationship with Ellie and his utter disregard for her well-being. To Marley, Ellie's marriage had been nothing more than a business deal, plain and simple. His financial desperation and cold treatment of his daughter painted a picture of a man who placed no value on Ellie's dreams or her happiness. The detectives left Marley's home with the sense that, while he might not have directly been responsible for Ellie's death, his decision to sell her had likely played a pivotal role in setting her tragic end in motion. On June 24, 2013, a call came into Jesup police that would shift the course of Ellie Mae's case. The morning was thick with humidity, and heavy clouds gathered overhead as the call came from Wayne Memorial Hospital. Ellie's autopsy report revealed a startling detail: she was several weeks pregnant at the time of her death. This revelation took everyone by surprise, as no one in her life had been aware of her pregnancy. For detectives Coulson and Burke, this new information opened up a whole new line of inquiry. Ellie's pregnancy wasn't just an unexpected detail, it could very well have been a motive for her murder. The detectives quickly turned their attention to Ellie's relationships, retracing her steps over the past few months. They knew her marriage to Marshall DeWitt had been strained, and Ellie had frequently expressed her unhappiness. But with the revelation of her pregnancy, it seemed likely she had sought comfort elsewhere, possibly with someone she trusted. The detectives began to wonder if Ellie had formed a connection with someone outside her marriage and started searching for leads on who the potential father of her child might be. Detective Coulson decided to look into Ellie's text messages and social media activity, hoping to uncover more about her personal life. She primarily used an old Nokia cell phone for texting and had a simple, unassuming Facebook profile. Ellie's recent text messages didn't reveal much, just a few conversations with her friend, Bev Turner, about her dream of moving to Atlanta. However, her phone records showed something more intriguing, a pattern of late-night calls to a number from out of town. After tracing the number, the detectives discovered it belonged to a traveling contractor who had recently worked in the area. When they tracked him down, the contractor admitted to having had a brief, illicit one-night stand with Ellie during his time in town. The contractor confirmed that he and Ellie had shared a night together, talking about their dreams and frustrations. He admitted that he was unaware of her marital problems and had no idea she might have been pregnant. Though he seemed genuinely saddened by Ellie's death, the detectives kept him under suspicion, continuing to dig deeper into his background and any possible connection to her tragic end. Armed with this new information, Coulson and Burke refocused their attention on their previous suspects, particularly Marshall. If Ellie had been pregnant by another man, Marshall's reaction could have easily turned violent. The detectives now suspected that discovering Ellie's pregnancy might have triggered his anger, viewing it as a deep embarrassment that threatened both his rigid beliefs and his carefully maintained public reputation. With this new lead, the investigators became more convinced than ever that Ellie's murder was far more complex than they had initially thought. As their inquiry led them down unexpected paths, Coulson and Burke turned their attention to another person close to Ellie, her friend, Bev Turner. At 36, Bev was the daughter of the local liquor store owner in Jesup and often worked as a cashier there. Bev was known by some as a reliable employee and a quiet, reserved person. Over the past year, she had developed a close friendship with Ellie, becoming one of the few people Ellie trusted enough to confide in. Ellie often visited her during Bev's shifts at the store, and as the detectives dug deeper, they began to suspect that Bev might have had deeper, possibly romantic feelings for Ellie. Locals had observed subtle shifts in Bev's behavior whenever Ellie mentioned her dream of leaving Jesup for Atlanta. Though Bev's reserved nature often masked her emotions, there was an undeniable possessiveness in her reactions. She became noticeably tense when Ellie talked about starting a new life, and friends had remarked on how her demeanor would change whenever Ellie spoke of leaving town. The question lingered in the air: was Bev simply a concerned friend, or did she feel threatened by the idea of losing Ellie's friendship and possibly more? Detective Burke decided it was time to bring Bev in for questioning. She arrived wearing her usual work uniform, a plain polo shirt with the shop's logo, and seemed visibly uneasy as she sat down across from the detectives. They began the interview by asking Bev about her friendship with Ellie and whether she knew anything about Ellie's relationships, including her marriage to Marshall. Bev answered calmly, though her hands trembled slightly as she spoke. When asked directly about Ellie's pregnancy, she paused, claiming she hadn't known Ellie was expecting. Her reaction seemed genuine, but the detectives couldn't shake the feeling that her hesitation on other questions suggested she was holding something back. As the questioning continued, the detectives picked up on subtle moments of tension in Bev's responses. When asked if she had ever seen Ellie with the traveling contractor, Bev's reply was terse, and her eyes narrowed slightly. She admitted that she sometimes felt protective of Ellie, adding that she had warned her against getting too close to strangers, fearing she might be taken advantage of. The defensiveness in her tone raised a few more red flags for the detectives. Bev's responses painted a picture of someone who, beneath her mild-mannered exterior, might have harbored deeper, more intense feelings for Ellie. While the evidence linking her to Ellie's death remained slim, the detectives sensed there was more to her story than she was letting on. As they left the interrogation room, they remained unconvinced, that Bev had told them everything. In the days following the interview, Bev remained on the list of suspects, with detectives hoping further investigation would reveal whether her connection to Ellie was purely friendly or something deeper. After weeks of digging, the pieces of Ellie Mae's tragic story began to fall into place. Detectives Coulson and Burke eventually uncovered the evidence they needed to confirm what they had suspected all along: Marshall DeWitt, Ellie's husband, was her killer. As they reviewed more details of Ellie's life and her troubled marriage, they uncovered a disturbing pattern of control and manipulation that pointed directly to Marshall. For Marshall, a retired pastor with rigid views on authority and morality, Ellie's pregnancy, especially since it wasn't his, was a direct challenge to his control. He saw it not just as a betrayal, but as a personal disgrace. To him, Ellie's actions had brought shame to his reputation and the strict household he had worked so hard to maintain. His anger festered, fueled by the belief that she had humiliated him in front of the community he held dear. Late on June 21, 2013, Marshall confronted Ellie about her pregnancy. His possessiveness had always been evident, especially in how he had prevented her from pursuing her dreams. During this confrontation, Ellie attempted to explain herself, but Marshall's anger erupted. As her attempts to defend herself only seemed to fuel his rage, the situation quickly spiraled out of control. Marshall, feeling utterly betrayed, became consumed by his fury. When it was over, Marshall placed Ellie's body near the railroad tracks on the outskirts of Jesup, hoping that her death would be mistaken for a random attack or tragic accident. In the days following the discovery of Ellie's body, detectives considered several possible suspects. However, as the investigation progressed, physical evidence began to point squarely at Marshall. Lab tests confirmed that the belt used in the murder matched one Marshall had been seen wearing in multiple photos taken at local church events. The connection was undeniable. A closer look at Marshall's recent behavior revealed more inconsistencies in his alibi. Neighbors reported hearing loud arguments coming from his home in the days leading up to Ellie's death, and during a search of the property, police discovered letters from Ellie, hinting at her desire to leave him. These letters, coupled with the physical evidence and mounting testimony, provided the detectives with the final pieces they needed. With the case against him growing stronger, Marshall was arrested for the murder of his wife, Ellie Mae DeWitt. On July 15, 2013, detectives approached Marshall at his home. He answered the door with his usual somber expression, seemingly unfazed as the officers informed him of the charges against him. The reality of the situation didn't appear to fully register until the cold snap of handcuffs clicked around his wrists, a stark reminder that his world was about to unravel. Marshall's calm demeanor finally faltered, and for the first time, witnesses noticed a flicker of panic in his eyes. The arrest shook him, but it wasn't enough to stir any real remorse. Instead, as the officers led him away, he muttered under his breath, his voice barely audible, "She betrayed me. She betrayed me. She..." His words, laced with anger, revealed a man consumed not by guilt, but by a deep sense of personal injury. As news of Marshall's arrest spread through Jesup, Ellie's family was overwhelmed with a complex mix of relief and anger. The revelation that someone so close to Ellie could betray her in such a brutal way was a bitter pill to swallow. At the same time, the community, still reeling from the loss of a young woman with so much potential, found some semblance of closure, though it was overshadowed by the deep sadness of her life and dreams being cut short. Marshall DeWitt's trial began in March 2015, and the entire town of Jesup watched intently as the tragic story of Ellie Mae's life and death unfolded in court, a painful reminder of the darkness that had festered beneath their seemingly quiet community. On one side of the courtroom stood prosecutor Wendy Gates, 42, a sharp-minded attorney renowned for her unwavering commitment to justice in Wayne County. Gates presented the case with methodical precision, painting a clear picture of the control Marshall had exercised over Ellie Mae throughout their marriage and ultimately in her final days. She argued that Ellie's pregnancy, a development Marshall couldn't control or accept, was the tipping point that drove him to murder her in cold blood. Gates carefully laid out the evidence, from the belt used in the crime to the emotional manipulation Marshall had subjected Ellie to, building a compelling case that this was a crime rooted in power, possession, and an obsessive need to maintain control. Marshall's defense attorney, Clyde Stanton, 55, took a controversial and unconventional approach to the case. A seasoned lawyer with experience handling complex cases, Stanton invoked Marshall's deep-rooted religious beliefs as the foundation of his defense. He argued that Marshall had acted out of a twisted sense of righteousness, claiming that, in his eyes, Ellie's pregnancy, especially with another man, was a grave sin. Stanton portrayed his client as a man who had been driven to take extreme measures to discipline Ellie, rather than a cold-blooded murderer. The defense hinged on the argument that Marshall's actions were born from what he believed was his divine duty, despite the horrific nature of the crime. This biblical defense painted Marshall as a man whose actions, while undeniably wrong, were driven by his twisted sense of faith. Stanton sought to convince the jury that, despite the brutality of the crime, Marshall's motives weren't rooted in malice, but in a misguided belief that he was upholding what he saw as moral order. The defense was shocking to many, including Ellie's grieving family, who had trouble reconciling the claim of righteous motivation with the cold, calculated nature of the murder. Yet, despite its emotional impact, the defense seemed to resonate with some members of the jury, leaving the case hanging in a delicate balance as they deliberated. The defense's argument seemed to evoke some sympathy, or at least an understanding of Marshall's distorted mindset. After days of deliberation, the jury reached a controversial verdict: guilty of second-degree murder. Many had expected a more severe conviction, but instead Marshall was sentenced to 20 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 15 years. The decision left the courtroom in stunned silence, as both Ellie's family and the community struggled to comprehend the relatively lenient sentence for such a brutal crime. The verdict seemed to underscore the complexity of Marshall's motivations, but also left a lingering sense of injustice, as many believed his actions were more than just the result of a misguided belief. They were a premeditated act of violence. Marshall displayed little emotion when the verdict was announced. As he stood to hear his sentence, a faint look of satisfaction crossed his face, as if he believed his defense had been validated. To him, the outcome seemed to reinforce his view of himself as a victim, wronged by Ellie, rather than a man responsible for her death. For Ellie's family, the verdict felt like an incomplete form of justice. They had hoped for a harsher sentence that would better match the cruelty of Marshall's actions. Friends and neighbors of Ellie shared their frustration, feeling that the 20-year sentence was far too lenient, allowing Marshall to avoid the full weight of his crime. As Marshall was escorted away, Ellie's family and friends were left to grapple with the harsh reality that her life and dreams had been worth only a fraction of the justice they had hoped for. The trial, which concluded in March 2015, marked a turning point for everyone involved. Marshall DeWitt was taken to Georgia State Prison in Wrightsville, where he began serving his 20-year sentence. But for Ellie's loved ones, the emotional scars would remain long after the courtroom doors closed.